watching the intersection of money and power. This is Political Capital. I am Karabole Tlhatla. This morning, Transparency International released its 2018 Corruption Perception Index, and it paints a worrying picture not only of net declines in the perception of corruption around the world, but also declines in democracy. We'll be discussing this with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa and, of course, South Africa later on in the show. And also up on the show, numerous African countries are gearing up for elections. We do a roundup of what the political and investor premium risk will be as they head for the polls. Now, first, according to the newly released Corruption Perception Index for 2018, while there's been significant gains made by countries like New Zealand, Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, more than 120 of the 180 countries on the index scored below 50 on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being the least. David Lewis is Executive Director at Corruption Watch, and he discussed the outcomes with me earlier. David Lewis, thank you very much for your time. When you look at this year's Corruption Perception Index released this morning by Transparency International, surely that must make depressing reading for you, considering the number of African countries that fail to score above average, and the average is 43. That's really low.
Yeah, you know, it doesn't make for pleasant reading. I mean, on the other hand, I suppose we thankful for small mercies. We haven't declined further in the index. I mean, there are many, in fact, 8 sub-Saharan African countries that rank better than we do, and that's an interesting bit of data to look at for those who say, if we're not careful, we'll go the way the rest of Africa. Well, if we went the way of the 8 countries that are ranked above us, we would do better than we're doing at the moment.
David, one only looks at that and looks at the global picture. About 2/3 of the countries that have been on the index, and that's 180 countries. So that means over 120 countries fail to go above 50. Isn't that a worrying trend for democracies throughout the world, especially when you look at the rise of strongman politics?
It is, absolutely. I mean, you know, just take South Africa, for example. You know, we've seen how the state capture project, for example, not only necessitated capturing those institutions where the money was, the big state-owned enterprises and big spending government departments, it also had to capture key pillars of the democracy like the National Prosecuting Authority, even Parliament, the criminal justice institutions. I mean, on the other hand, we've also seen how key aspects of the democracy, like our free media, our robust civil society, our independent judiciary, have manifestly helped constrain democracy. So democracy has worked both ways, or corruption has worked both ways. Democracy has both constrained it, but corruption has also weakened key elements of the democracy. And I think that relationship probably pertains in most of the countries under examination.
David, you look at countries that have performed well, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, Seychelles, Botswana, and Cabo Verde, which, you know, have shown significant improvements there. But of course, there's the bottom loungers, and that is Somalia and South Sudan. What is the solution to getting these countries, to making sure that they don't get left behind? Some say that the African Union must prioritize investments in these countries. Do you share that thought?
Well, you know, it's not, you know, for the African Union to prioritize investments. I mean, the African Union are not the investors. It's for these countries. You know, most of these countries are countries in a state of war or near war. And it's very difficult to build the kind of institutions that attract investment under those circumstances. And it's also very difficult to limit corruption under those circumstances. So, you know, you'll see in sub-Saharan Africa, as elsewhere, the countries with the weakest institutions are the most corrupt countries. You know, we have a country like the United States, whose institutions have been threatened by strongman politics as exemplified by the Trump administration. But they do have very well established institutions which have prevented them from sliding further down the scale, even though their president seems to be as corrupt as any president anywhere has been. So it's about strong institutions. And in South Africa, some of our institutions have held up. Those have been, as I said, the media, the judiciary, and civil society organizations. Other institutions haven't held up, like Parliament, like the NPA, like a number of the regulators. So it's really about the strength or the relative strength or weakness of your country's institutions.
David, you and I know that this index looks at the perception of public sector corruption. But you and I have been following the proceedings at the Zondo Commission, and we heard Angelo Agrizzi take the stand and name names. But I know that you and I found it peculiar how easily corruptible or willingness to be corruptible is the private sector, especially the story of jumbo liquor wholesalers and how they sold money to Bosasa. I mean, that for me says that we are in very dire straits if private sector is not even trying to make sure that government holds up its end of the bargain.
Look, I mean, the private sector has much to answer for in relation to South Africa's corruption. I mean, there have been firms like McKinsey, KPMG, SAP, very well-established global private sector firms that have been involved in corruption. I wouldn't tar the private sector with Bosasa and the Guptas, for example, that I think are a criminal conspiracy. They are as much about business as Tony Soprano is about the waste management business. But I agree with you. I found the Jumbo Liquors story particularly depressing. I mean, this is a relatively small business, and yet some guy there found it in himself to be involved in a major instance of money laundering, in effect, for skimming some off the top. I think that is a pretty, nobody other than you has picked up on this in the various interviews that I've done. But I did find that a particularly depressing aspect of the Bosasa story, as I did the fact that it reached so deeply and widely. For example, some MPs that have been implicated who I never would have thought would be implicated in corruption, and they have been corrupted, and you're right, they've been corrupted by money, and money generally resides with the ability to corrupt people resides with the private sector, and this is what has happened.
It's definitely getting pegged at the feeding trough. But David, the irony of it all is that everyone who runs for office, for public office in Africa, talks about tackling corruption. Yet we haven't found any implementations. I mean, among your countries to watch on this year's index is still South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Botswana. That, I don't know if we're going to get the level of cooperation that we need for these leading lights in Africa to actually take the baton and run with it, show the implementation of clean governance.
Yeah, as I said, it's about leadership and institutions. I mean, Botswana, as it so happens, has done, particularly well, and has done particularly well consistently. Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, the sort of big muscle on the continent, have not done so well. And, I don't know if you're aware of it, very few people are, but last year, in 2018, the theme of the African Union was time to end corruption. Yeah, exactly. Not too many people noticed it, I'm afraid. And we do need a real thrust against corruption in the subcontinent, and we need very clear leadership on this level. Without that, and without building, as I say, independent prosecutorial institutions, independent law enforcement institutions, parliaments who are able to actually exercise oversight over the executive and not depend upon them, these are all critical factors. And some involve legislative reform, others involve exemplary leadership. And I'm afraid in none of the countries that you mentioned has the leadership been exemplary.
David, a parting question to you. Let's bring it back home to South Africa. Hypothetically, if this particular index was released off the back of the Zondo Commission and half of the things that we've heard, even if half is the truth, I mean, would South Africa be where it is now? And also, as a parting question, I guess South Africa's current position does not really inspire confidence when you think that the current president is also tainted by some of the money from Bosasa.
Yeah, that hasn't helped things any. And, I think he still has issues to answer there. But, I think the Zondo Commission will have a contrary effect on perceptions of corruption in South Africa. I think on the one hand, it's revealing, as we've just discussed, extraordinary levels of corruption and an extraordinary breadth of corruption. On the other hand, it's also out there in the open, and there is this commission of inquiry, and evidence is being held, and it is being televised. And I think that should say something positive about the will to tackle corruption. So I'm not sure what way perceptions would go when account is taken of the Zondo Commission. I think there are impulses that will drive us down the ladder, but there are also factors that will drive us up the ladder.
David Lewis, Executive Director of Corruption Watch, we thank you for your time, and we will continue to call on you again, sir. Thank you very much. That's David Lewis. When we return, we do an African election roundup as numerous countries gear up to go to the polls, among them Nigeria, South Africa, and later on in the year, Botswana. Stay with us.